If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5. This is one of my favorite narratives in the Old Testament, and there's a lot to it. And we as human beings in the modern West, I think you can see this too based upon many of our reactions to the recent election. We like things the way they are. We don't like to see dramatic shifts in our lifestyle, dramatic shifts in the economic certainties, dramatic shifts in the way in which life is conducted in this country. I mean, most of us like to see things carry on. And we all would say, I hope we'd say, boy, I would like to have more of God's presence in my life. But is that really what we really want? It seems that sometimes we like the idea of it, but when it comes down to brass tacks, where we're really being changed in some way, what we really are saying is, God, we'd like for you to just make a few minor adjustments around the edges and leave us pretty much alone. Very different than saying, God, here I am, do with me as you wish. Let's take a look at this text and see what it would teach us in this regard. I'll begin reading in verse 1 of 2 Kings chapter 5. Naaman, the commander of the king of Syria's army, was esteemed and respected by his king. For through Naaman the Lord had given the Syrian military victories. But this great warrior had a skin disease, and some translations will say leprosy. Raiding parties went out from Syria and took captive from the land of Israel a young girl who became a servant to Naaman's wife. And she told her mistress, if only my master were in the presence of the prophet who is in Samaria, then the prophet would cure my master of his skin disease. Naaman went and told his king what the girl from the land of Israel had said. And the king of Syria said, go, I'll send a letter to the king of Israel for you. And so Naaman went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 suits of clothing. He brought the letter to the king of Israel, and it read, this is the letter of introduction for my servant Naaman, whom I have sent to be cured of his skin disease. When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, am I God? Can I kill or restore life? Why does this man ask me to cure a man of his skin disease? Certainly you must see that this king of Syria is looking for an excuse for a fight. When Elisha the prophet heard that the king had torn his clothes, he sent message to the king of Israel saying, why did you tear your clothes? Send the man to me so that he may know there's a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood in the doorway of Elisha's house. Elisha sent out his messenger who told Naaman, go wash 7 times in the Jordan River and your skin will be restored and you'll be healed. Well, Naaman went away angry. He said, look, I thought surely this man would come out, stand there, invoke the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the area and cure the skin disease. The rivers of Damascus, Abana, and Pharpar, are they better than the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be healed? So he turned around and went away angry. But Naaman's servants approached him and said, O master, if the prophet had told you to do some difficult task, would you have been willing to do it? It seems that you should be happy that he said, just go wash in the river and be healed. So Naaman went down and dipped in the Jordan 7 times, as the prophet had instructed. His skin became as smooth as a young child's skin, and he was healed. Now this is where Naaman is, he has a very specific desire in his life, and he wants to be healed of this skin disease. He's a successful general. He's noteworthy in his country. He's been given victories. And I thought it fascinating that the Bible says Naaman, as the Syrian, was given the victories by God. I wonder what that means. What was it that Naaman had as a significance in that region of the world that he would go and have victories, and those victories were given to him by God? And one of the places he had victory over is Israel itself. So there's something going on here. Naaman, the military leader, could be, and I would say based on the text, is being used to judge Israel for something, because he's been given military success in Israel, such to the point that he captures a servant girl. and takes her home as a slave in his household. Now the servant girl, we don't know her name. She's nowhere mentioned. But she's the key to this whole story. This entire narrative hinges on this servant girl. She's lowly, she's not famous, there's no name given for her, and yet she is the vector for God Almighty to work in Naaman's life. That Naaman becomes a worshiper of God in this story. Naaman is sent by his king, who in this case is Ben-Hadad II. If you go back in history and read about this around the 900s BC, or even later, actually earlier than that, the 1100s BC, you'll find that Ben-Hadad was roughly the king. And if you go on in the text, you find him named. So Ben-Hadad II is sent to Elisha with this gigantic gift. And if you do the math, I did the math. I wanted to see what kind of gifts did all this add up to. It's about $60,000 to $75,000 worth of stuff. I mean, significant gifting. If you're going to go to Elisha and hand Elisha 75 grand to come out and heal you of something, that's significant. Well, Israel's king doesn't react to this well at all, and that makes sense to me because he's fearful. Syria is a superpower on the world stage in Mesopotamia at this time in history. So Naaman comes to Elisha's house now with certain expectations. And he comes in a very specific way. If you read verse 9, it says, Naaman came to Elijah's house with all his chariots and horses. So it's almost like the paparazzi should have been assembled there at this moment. It's like the Hollywood movie stars who show up at a red carpet premiere and they step out in front of this backdrop and then the flashes go off for 10 minutes while they preen and rotate and show every bit of their dresses and suits to all of the paparazzi. That's the way Naaman shows up. He shows up with all his horses and chariots. He doesn't come to the house and knock on the door all by himself. He shows up, here are all my medals, here's all the armor. Can you imagine? I mean, when he came to the door, all the metal and the armor and everything else jingling all over these horses. That's how Naaman shows up. He shows up saying, look at who I am. I'm somebody. I mean, I'm important. And yet, this is something that if you don't know much about the Middle East, this wouldn't make any sense to you. Naaman is angry. Why is he angry? He's angry because Gehazi is sent out. The servant of the house is sent out to greet Naaman. The owner of the home, Elisha himself, doesn't come out. That's a huge affront. He has offended Naaman just in this one act. Naaman shows up to be healed. But there's something very significant here that you see emerging in the text. Naaman shows up to be healed on his terms. That's the key to it. He shows up, he's doing all these things, but he shows up on his terms. Shows up in all his finery, shows up with all this money, shows up with the king's letter, and he's come there with an expectation, and a very specific one. What the text says it. He expected Elisha to come out and give him a sort of a Harry Potter moment. Wave a wand over the place, invoke the name of his God, Yahweh, and then somehow this would all happen, and Naaman would go back, give him the gifts, and Naaman would go back healed. Naaman is saying something here to God that I think it would do us well to think about for just a moment. Here's what Naaman is saying without stating it. God, I just want you to make a few adjustments in the places that I point out to you that need adjustment. Take my life just like it is, famous general. Remove a few difficulties like this skin disease. Guide me a little bit, and then leave me alone and I'll let you know when I need you again. That is essentially what's being said. And I look at that and I think, that is what we say to God a lot. Now, I know we don't think that. And I don't like to think it of myself either. But if I'm really being honest, that is what I say to God most days. When I'm praying in the morning before work and thinking about what I'd like to see God do, I'm just going to be honest here and say most of the time I'm praying that God would make some minor adjustments because I kind of like where I am and what I'm doing already. I don't really want Him to do anything too radical to me. Well, it seems to me there are three biblical words that we don't really capture in our understanding. Life, surrender, and worship. We don't really understand what these words mean. We think we do. We have pictures in our head, but we don't really understand them. Let's just take them in order and think about them a little bit. Let's just take the word life. I was a trained musician, and I went on the road with 2 different bands, and it was awesome. I can't express to you how fulfilling those experiences were. I look back on that and I think, wow, what could it have been? But if I'm really being honest about it in myself, there was more than just the beauty of being able to play guitar at that level. There was something else I was looking for. I was looking for something more. I was looking that maybe we would become famous, that maybe we would become so noteworthy that this would be the entirety of my life in some way. I wasn't concerned deeply about what God might or might not want for me. And so life for me had a certain picture. When somebody said, Rip, show us the picture of your life, it had a certain picture, a certain way of looking at life as it progressed that I had expectations about. Kind of like Naaman, who had expectations when he showed up at Elisha's house. You know, it's funny. If you look at life in this sense, there's a distinction. The second word is worship. And think about life and worship. Put them in as 2 categories. And think about, for instance, the first 2 humans in the garden. This is very significant to me. In the garden, life was composed of, given to them by God. And he gave them specific instructions. He said, rule and subdue the earth. So the whole earth is yours. And be fruitful and multiply. And that was it. If you take those first 2 chapters of Genesis, there is no worship service given in those first 2 chapters. It's not until the fall that there's a worship service of some kind, sacrifices. There is none prior. Why is that? Well, it's because in the garden, all we would have had to do had we not fallen was just be human beings before God. Obey the rules, subdue the earth, care for the earth, and be fruitful and multiply. And the earth was going to provide all of our needs. And our reflectance of God back to himself as worship was that we would just live as human beings, as his creation. That's it. Well, that's not the way it is now. So for us, worship becomes something very different. I'll never forget when Becky and I were looking for a church, and a lot of the churches we looked at were larger, much larger. And in them they had printed bulletins that were given out at the church service. You know, either you got it at the door or there was one waiting for you in the pew. And several of them said at the top of the page, the worship of God. So they were making a statement about the service, that this is the worship of God. But that's not what the Bible says about worship at all. You know, Paul says, put yourself on the altar as a living sacrifice. This is your acceptable service of worship. What does that mean? It goes back to that first word, life. It means everything. Your life, my life, is supposed to be something that we hand over to God fully, without expectations as to what God might say that life will be composed of. The first 2 humans, when they were planted in the garden, they didn't ask questions about what they were going to be doing. God told them, and that was it. And life and worship were co-equal, co-extensive. They were connected fully. But when we fell, worship got detached from life in the way it's supposed to be. I don't think it's any accident that Paul, post-cross, restores that connection, that life and worship are coextensive. They're not separated things. That's why when the top of the bulletin says the worship of God, it's wrong. This what we're doing in here is such a sliver of life. You take all the days of the week, 6 days a week, and here we are on the first day of the week, and we're doing this. But this is just the tiny, strange-looking sliver of what the rest of the week looks like. Most of life And Paul says it's that most of life that we hand over as our spiritual service of worship. If our lives are inconsistent with what we say we believe in general, then what we say we believe becomes irrelevant, completely irrelevant. Then the last word is surrender. Now, we love to quote Romans 8:28. God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. But we tend to fail to see where the good is applied. Whose good is it? It's not necessarily mine or yours. It's God's good. What God says is good. That's how it's supposed to work out. So it changes the way in which we respond to things. I mean, what we're saying to God in that passage, the way most people understand it, and the way I understood it for years, was, God, it's raining and I've got to get groceries. Could I have a parking place near the door? Right? Or I've got to be somewhere by 10:30. Don't let the traffic be heavy. Now, those are the kinds of things where we think God working things together for the good, or we go to our mortgage supplier and we get a good interest rate. Now, I'm not saying that God doesn't do things like that. What I am saying is we're still saying to God, I just want you to tinker around the edges of my life, make adjustments that don't really bother me very much. In other words, improve it. Take what I've got already and just make it a little better. And we think of ourselves as saying to ourselves, I've surrendered my life because God's going to make these improvements, these little tweaks around the edges. If we really want what God wants, we may not get what we want. That's just how it is. Naaman was caved in, right? He argued. When they told him, they said, just go dip in the river. The servant, Gehazi, comes out. Go dip in the river, everything, you'll be healed. And he's angry about it. He doesn't want to do it that way. Why can't I go back to Damascus and dip in that river? The water's cleaner. Jordan River was pretty muddy. But Naaman surrendered his dignity and did it exactly as God commanded him to do. And look what happened. We think about, I've been here 15 years, be 16 in April. Wow. And we've never had a revival service. Well, that's not an accident. Because you don't schedule God for revivals. If you read the history of revivals, what do you see? You see a few people getting together and praying, and God shows up. And God does something. And everything is changed, and then it spreads. Very, very different. We can schedule revival. Every church, I didn't know this. Do you know I didn't know this until just a few years back, that churches have spring and fall revivals? I had no awareness of that at all. I didn't realize that they were on a calendar schedule. I said, wow, we can just put it on the calendar and God will show up that day or that week. That's not the way it works at all. We could schedule revival services for every Sunday from now till whenever. And it's going to be up to God as to how he shows up. And it's going to be up to God as to whether we're surrendered to him ourselves. What it looks like when we're surrendered. I mean, Gehazi is the perfect picture here. You got Naaman. Naaman finally gave in, right? And God said, you've done what I said. I'm going to reward that. I'm going to give you something for that. And of course, God was glorified because Naaman became a worshiper of God. He was converted by this. We know that. All you got to do is read the rest of the text and you'll see that Naaman became a follower of God. But Gehazi is interesting here because Gehazi, he's sent out, and all of Naaman's finery, the shields, the armor, the horses, the chariots are all out there jingling. The horses are stamping, and every time they hit the ground, something jingles. Just like you see in these movies where the cavalry shows up and all the horse parts, all that stuff you put on horses so you can ride them and jingle. I love those sounds in a movie. And Gehazi comes out with the message, tells Naaman, and then Gehazi sees Naaman get healed. But you see, he also saw the loot. He saw the stuff that was brought, the $60,000 to $75,000 worth of gold and silver and clothing. And so when Naaman leaves, Gehazi leaves behind him and chases him down. Text says that Naaman saw someone running toward them and he stopped the parade, and Gehazi caught up. Gehazi says to him, you know, Naaman, we've got some prophets back there that need some clothes and a little money, and it would be a big help to the prophets. I mean, he's just laying all this stuff on. If you could let me have some of that. And Naaman says, here, take double what you're asking for. We're happy. He brought it with him. He was going to give it anyway. And so Gehazi takes it back. Now, I'm thinking about Gehazi. And I'm thinking Gehazi had a very specific thing in mind in this moment. And his specific thing was, I want the rewards for this. And yet Gehazi had a front row seat to all of this. You know, Elisha did some pretty amazing things. Gehazi had a front row seat to all of it. If you read further in the text, in the next chapter, there's a line that says, the king of Syria says to himself, or to one of his assistants, he said, how is it that the king of Israel knows what we're going to do before we do it? And the assistant says to the king, Elisha knows what you say in your bedroom. God's telling Elisha what you say in your bedroom. Gehazi knows that. So Gehazi, when he comes back to the house, Elisha's waiting on him. And Elisha says, where were you? I love this. This is just a perfect answer. Gehazi says, nowhere. Now, if you've got a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 16-year-old and you ask them, where were you? And they say, nowhere. You know something's going on. You know they're somewhere they ought not to be. Gehazi forgot that God tells Elisha what the king of Syria says in his bedroom. And Gehazi got punished for it. It says in the text that Gehazi, once it was known he lied to Elisha, the leprosy that was on Naaman and had been healed was brought to Gehazi. I tell you, Paul says this to the church at Philippi. He says, my aim is to know Jesus, to experience the power of his resurrection, to share in his sufferings, to be like him in his death, and so somehow, now think about this is Paul saying this, somehow to attain the resurrection from the dead. It's a hope. Paul is hoping in humility that God would see him righteous to attain the resurrection from the dead. Now, it's not on performance at all. What it is on, though, is a surrendered heart. Corrie ten Boom said this, and I think she was exactly right. I don't know how much you know of Corrie ten Boom. I would recommend anybody who doesn't know anything about Corrie ten Boom, get on the internet, look her up, read her life story. She wound up in a concentration camp. She was Dutch. They were hiding Jews in their home. They got caught, and their family was sent to the concentration camp along with the Jews. She survived. But she says this, surrender a little to God, and he gives back in proportion to the surrender. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me,